Gašper Beguš, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
We're talking about language, and this was the first linguistic test of the day, but I hope I didn't butcher your name too badly. I have a very simple question for you to start off with. What is language, and in what ways is the human capacity to communicate by the use of language exceptional in the animal kingdom, or in fact in the world beyond animals?
Actually, it's not a simple question at all. Actually, it's an extremely complex question, and I don't actually know what language is. And I'm a linguist, and I should probably know what a language is. So I think it depends. Nobody has a really good definition of language, and maybe definitions are not even that useful. Um, for a while, we defined language as the thing that sets us apart from animals. So it's the communication system that humans have, right? But if you look at closely, I think the better question is like what properties of human language exist and what are the uniquely human properties about our language, right? So just
So, so
like
before so before
dissect
we get there,
language.
that sounds great. Before we get there, like, what's an example of some form of language that animals might use? For example, if you're saying actually we have to look at the specific properties and what sort of makes human language different from other
Right,
language,
right.
like what are some simple examples of how animals use language, but perhaps not human
Right.
language, but that should count in some sense as language?
Right, right. Well, so that's the real difficult question. Like you have to look into what other animals have, right? And for example, animals have alarm calls, right? So there's some acoustic vocalization, and that denotes, a danger from above or danger from the ground. Now that those alarm calls are oftentimes not learned vocalizations, right? So with language, you want to have learned, culturally transmitted vocalization, right? So not something like a cry that you come pre-born with, but something that you learn
So,
from
so, so,
your
so a dog
caregivers.
might yelp when they're in pain, and a dog in the
Exactly,
United States and in Germany and in South Africa is going to yelp more or
exactly,
less the same way. And dogs have an innate ability to understand that is a
exactly.
fellow member of a species that's in pain. But that's not language because it's not culturally transmitted. It doesn't vary in this kind of way. It's not specific enough. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, yeah. So, for example, you take a vervet monkey or a Campbell monkey, and you have that monkey grow up in the other monkey's world, right? So you take one species, put it into another species, and that first species will still speak its own innate or like have innate cries. Whereas if we want to have language, our language is obviously culturally learned, right? It can take any
Mm.
child, and any child can hear at the beginning of their lives any language contrast, any sounds of language, and then slowly they build their internal neural connections such a way that they only hear and attend to the language that they actually hear. But in principle, anything can, a child can learn any language, and so it's learned communication. It changes a lot. We have dialects. The reason we have dialects is
Mm.
because at some point there's a mother language, and then there are daughter language, and the daughter language become arise because of mutations and changes in language. So those are all the things that you're looking for, and then there are more complex things you have to look for in animals, right? So um, is there a lexical principle? Is there, can they talk about things that are not immediately present? And I would say there are like two broad ways to study a language in non-humans. One is to take our language and train other animals in our language. So those would be called language-trained animals. And
So
there
became
were some
obsessed a number of years ago with all of the very cute dogs on Instagram and I suppose TikTok, for I don't use
right,
TikTok, which use buttons with words. And there's a very long history of us fooling ourselves to think that animals are communicating with us. There's a horse by the name of Clever Hans, and it turned out that
right,
in some ways there was I forget whether the owner knew that they were kind of cheating and giving Hans signals, or whether they were doing it unwittingly. I forget the details of the case, but
right.
it turned out that Hans wasn't as clever as he seemed. But there are some really remarkable clips in this, in which it does seem
Yes.
like these dogs that have access to 100 150 buttons, um, you know construct these relatively long sentences, if you want to call them that. They don't quite have grammar, which are situationally appropriate, and which don't seem like they're just, pressing a random button like "love you" because they know that their owner seems to be happy when they press that button. There seems to be something more than that going on. Is there?
Well, I mean, there are even, I would say, even more impressive studies done in the 90s, probably. I started my research in animals with Irene Pepperberg, who was the pioneer of basically language-trained animal, who had one of the most, one of the smartest animal parrot ever lived, who was Alex the parrot. There's work on bonobos. Kanzi recently, passed away, and they basically try to bring some interface to the animals so that they could communicate with humans. There's also work on dolphins, for example. So Kanzi had this keyboard with symbols that had nothing to do with the object they described, and he was able to use them and even combine them. With parrots, it's great because they don't need any interface at all, right? They learned to mimic our human language to perfection. I have recordings of Alex actually, and I'm studying them, and it's just so amazing how close they can mimic us and mastering mimicking our language to the degree that we're never able to do the other way around, right? And so, that was kind of the first insight I would say into how smart animals are, because parrots probably were considered smart at that time, but not exceptionally smart. Now you have Irene Pepperberg training Alex the parrot, and Alex could count up to 3 or 4. It could not only that, you could give it a plate of like green balls and blue squares, and it could count, like ask him how many green ball, and it would like figure, count and distinguish compositionally between shape and objects, and so on. So that was like maybe the first time we really started to appreciate their intelligence. So that's language animal communication, or like language trained animals, right, where you take human language and you try to instill it upon
Right.
animals.
And so that's not a language that animals use to communicate with each other, but it
Right,
shows that they have
right.
a capacity to process language in some kind of way, since we're able to teach a version of our language to them, and then they can use that to communicate with us. What about forms that of language that animals have to communicate with each other? For those of you who are listening to this or reading the transcript, I see your face nicely framed by many whales in a beautiful poster hanging behind you. Whales seem to be quite remarkable in the way they communicate, including the fact, as my producer Leo points out to me, that supposedly this may be untrue. Baby whales babble in the same way that human
Yes.
babies babble, seemingly to sort of learn, how to communicate, to learn to make the sounds that they need to in order to then accurately communicate to other members of a species.
Right.
Um, is that a good example of sort of communication within one species of animals, and what kind of features of language does that have?
Well, and so that's where it becomes really difficult, right? Because you train an animal in your human language, you understand what the animal is saying, right? Because it's your language, and but if you're like observing animals in the wild, right? It's you don't know that language, you don't speak that language, you don't even know what is meaningful in that language, if anything at all, right? So you go from this terrain where you have your language, you understand most of the things, and most of the like Kanzi was probably at the level of a 3-year-old human baby, right? It's always think of these animal research in terms of developmentally, right? So roughly, if we compare it to our human child, where roughly are there how many words, what kind of abilities? And so then you go into animals in the wild, and that's where we're really just starting in some ways. So first of all, there was in the back in the day there weren't as sophisticated recording equipment available. Um, they and it just takes a lot of work. Like for example, whales live in open ocean. They dive very deep. It's not easy to just record them and try to see what they do. And so um, a lot of animals obviously communicate for mating purposes, right? They vocalize for mating purposes. So you have birdsong, and bird songs function for those bird songs that are learned. Actually, are not innate, right? So the father usually teaches male offsprings to sing, and the idea is like, I'm very fit because in addition to searching for food, I can also practice these beautiful notes.
But I imagine that a
Uh,
skeptic would say that that doesn't count as language because
exactly.
it's a form of communication, obviously, but it's really a form of signaling, right? It's just showing I have the
Yes.
extra time and resources to sit around with my dad and be taught this beautiful
Right.
melody,
Right.
and I can put protein, whatever else it takes, into my vocal cords, so I have a nice, loud, clear voice, and all of that is a signal of evolutionary fitness in the same kind of way in which a peacock has a beautiful tail, and that's not, the tail doesn't mean anything, presumably. Perhaps it does, and we've missed it, but like it's not like the pattern of a tail has a significant with semantic meaning, but it is a sign of evolutionary fitness. And so presumably, even though those melodies are passed on from bird to bird, there may be differences within a species and how they sing and so on. A skeptic would say that's not language in the kind of way in which perhaps whales have language.
Right. Exactly. So that's where we get to whales. So you're absolutely right. So the mating function is not that exciting from a perspective of human language or like comparing human language to other species. But birds have alarm calls, and monkeys have alarm calls, and so on. Now, the really interesting things I think happen with whales. The reason why I love studying whales is because they don't vocalize for mating at all. At least our whales don't. So humpback whales vocalize for mating. Sperm whales are basically just females, and they form complex societies. And based on the dialects they speak, they form families and clans. And crucially, they communicate, they exchange vocalizations, learned vocalizations. We know they're learned because the baby whales babble, and because obviously there's a lot of variation in dialects. And so they exchange those communications while hunting, before they dive 2 kilometers deep to hunt, and when socializing, and during giving births. So at these events where you would think that something meaningful, some transmission of meaningful information is taking place, not just, signaling of fitness.
Wow. And so presumably one difference would be that if you take a bird from one locality and put it in the vicinity of other birds of that species, the birds of that species might sort of go, oh wow, we haven't heard that melody before, and I know that makes that melody more attractive to them or less attractive to them, but they would still get the melody in the same way as they might get the melody of a bird in the vicinity. Whereas I take it that with whales, because it is sort of culturally bound in that way, it appears to be the fact that the language of a dialect they use changes depending on, I know what the right word is, the pod or the tribe or the group
Yeah.
of whales you're talking about. If you somehow were able to take a whale from a completely different geography and put it in communication with other whales, they might struggle to understand each other the way that I would struggle to understand somebody if I was dropped in the middle of Vietnam and people there didn't happen to speak English.
Yes, I mean some birds' vocalizations are learned as well, and it's actually interesting. You cannot learn human language as a human unless you get linguistic, and guess you get language, you hear language from the beginning. So there are some really unfortunate cases of child neglect or abuse that where children were not able to get language until they were
Kaspar
like
Hauser
12.
is the most famous case.
Exactly, and that's like the critical period, right? You're never gonna be able to fully master human language if you don't get it. And the same happens with birds. I mean, there are some experiments back in the day who if a bird with learned communication is not exposed to father's song, they will never master it to the same level as if they're exposed to it from birth.
Yeah,
Now
and
with whales, we cannot do such experiments.
right.
That would be ethically really problematic.
And I know that I mean I think with birds even it takes a number of generations to build back up the complexity of bird song that was there previously and so on. And I take the point that you made earlier that bird song changes from is passed down from father to son and therefore changes. But I meant something slightly different, right? Where we may not be able to do the experiment, So there's reason to believe that the function of whale language depends on mutual comprehension of the content of what they're saying, and that because different sets of whales have a particular linguistic conventions which help them communicate, if you introduced a whale from a totally different group, they just may not be able to communicate to each other what otherwise they would, right? Whereas presumably with a bird, where the purpose is just a mating call, right? The purpose is like, look how beautiful my bird song is. You know, if you take a bird from the same species but a different geographic region, you know, that may be a very different song from the local ones, but there would, you know, there wouldn't be that barrier to comprehension. They'd still say, oh, look, that bird sings a pretty interesting song, and that seems to take a lot of evolutionary resources, and so, you know, perhaps that's a good signal of evolutionary fitness. Like, it wouldn't lose the communicative potential in the same way that it might in the case of whales. But tell me, I mean, this is just me trying to respond to what you're saying.
No, that's certainly true for mating. That's certainly true for mating song, right? The question is, like, some birds also have learned vocalizations for like alarm calls, for example, and that's when it becomes interesting in birds. And for birds, in a sense, they're much easier to study, right? Because there's like a lot of work in animal communication research on birds and elephants, and we share so many things with birds and elephants, right? We share, we know you can conceptualize of a predator in birds or, elephants, and, they have trees, they have air, they have ground, all these things that are familiar to us. And then you come to whales, and like, you don't even know how to represent the presence of a predator because the ocean is so vast, and the light doesn't travel at all in the ocean, right? The light gets lost so fast. So we are so visual in some ways that we try to represent things visually, but whales don't probably represent things as much visually as they do with sound, right? So they navigate, they orient themselves, they hunt, and they escape predators by emitting echolocation sounds and then hearing what comes back. So it's really difficult to basically conceptualize of their world and make a good model of their worlds, because underwater life is just so different.
That's fascinating. Now, I think we have sort of different gradations, right? So we have birds that have a form of communication, but it mostly seems to be things like mating calls. We have whales where it's very hard to know exactly what's going on, but it seems to share some additional features with human language, like the fact that there's different languages and dialects and so on. Is there something specific about human language? How is it that human language is different from what whales seem to be doing?
Well, I can tell you roughly, I think, what the story was for 60 years, and I think how we should change it, maybe. So the idea was that, yes, human language is completely different, and for all sorts of reasons. One was, well, the main aspect of human language that was considered the uniquely human thing was the so-called recursion. It's slightly complex property of language, but roughly it says that you can take one element and embed it into the element of the same type. Okay, so Yascha said that Gašper said that whales have language. You can always make that sentence larger by saying Leo said that Yascha said that Gašper said that whales have language, and so on, right? So it's basically this kind of infinity loop of language in some ways. And obviously that hasn't been found. There are some attempts in birdsong, but that's really in animal kingdom, in the wild, that principle hasn't really been found. But it's a very complex principle, and there's so much we still don't know about animals that I'm not really surprised that it hasn't been found. And there are other things, like the animals cannot talk about things that are not immediately present. They don't talk about things that are in the past or in the future. They have only immediate. I think a lot of these things were debunked by various research at various research levels, right? So either with language trained animals, where bonobos were able to go to another room and talk about stuff. For example, also my favorite example is Alex the parrot saying "binary" for apple. So he couldn't say apple because it's difficult for them to say P. So he made up a word, binary. So apple is something that tastes like a banana but looks like a cherry. So he put words together, which shows
Oh, so it took me a moment. Why binary? That is really clever.
exactly. It's very clever, and it shows that they can do productive compositional compounding and stuff like that. So across the research, if you take these research studies seriously, you realize that there's very little human, uniquely human about language. I mean, not every other species have all the properties of human language, but there are bits and pieces across animals, especially language trained animals, and then we're only really starting to uncover the richness of animal communications in the wild. So I think slowly the properties of human language that are exclusively human are taking away. And like the big step now is also by artificial intelligence models, where and that's a whole different story, but some of the things that we thought were uniquely human and are never be able to are not supposed to be achievable with a general intelligence model are now achievable in these LLMs.
So I was just about to ask you about this. I mean, there's again these incredibly cute Instagram videos of humans communicating with dogs in various ways, and that's remarkable. But what's even more astonishing is that, I now communicate in, natural language with some artificial entity that, can easily pass itself off as human these days, that can pass the famous Turing test.
Right.
And this is very different from what computers did when I was younger, right? I mean, for a long time, we had these symbolic languages that we built, programming languages, and, they basically told the computer exactly kind of what digits to manipulate in response to some kind of request. And so that was this artificial interface that we needed to learn and that needed to be kind of hard baked into the computer for us to be able to communicate. And, that was very useful. That allowed, me to run some statistical analyses in a program, in a language like R. It allowed, much more sophisticated computer programmers to come up with things like Windows, so that we have a visual interface to, basically still tell the computer what to do on the basis of me clicking, and that generates some kind of code, and that in that symbolic language tells the computer what to do. That's just vastly different from the things that we're able to do today, where I can say, hey, Claude, tell me a poem, and it will. And I said, well, I don't like this part of it. What do you think of the strengths and weaknesses of a poem? And it just speaks to me in some ways like a human, in some ways not like a human, but using human language, right? So, have these AI systems learned language? Are they somehow very cleverly pretending to have learned language? Would that even be a meaningful distinction? What does it tell us that we can now have these in-depth, sophisticated communications in human language with this non-human entity, and in fact an entity that is not even an animal, unlike dogs and whales and birds and all these other things we've talked about?
No, exactly. I think that what these models have shown us is that you do not need language specific or human specific apparatus, either in your brain or anything else, or anywhere else, right? So that they show us what properties of language a general cognitive device can learn, right? Just a general cognitive, just an intelligent thing can learn, right? Because animals obviously are intelligent, and it was thought that, well, yeah, they're intelligent, but they don't have language because you need something specific about language. And the reason for that was there was the idea that we get little data as humans. Within 2-3 years, a child learns language pretty well. And that is impressive. If you think especially, I do a lot of modeling on, not with text, but in a way that human babies actually learn from sound. If you think of a human baby, it needs to learn impressively because, just the single word, like an apple. Imagine you're learning a word apple. You see an apple and you hear an apple sometimes, but also sometimes you hear an word apple and you don't see an apple, and then sometimes you see an apple and you don't hear anything. And so imagine all the things a child hears and all the things a child sees. It needs to make that match, that Saussurean match between the sound that denotes something and the actual object in the real world. It's not an easy thing. And we're trying to modeling things with ecological data, meaning the same amounts of data the child gets. It's not easy. But of course, artificial AI models are slightly different. I mean, they're modeled according to our brains, but you still have to computer program them. And so they'll have their own little quirks, and they need more data. And they need much more data. But at the end of the day, they learn
So
things.
2 points just to draw out here to make sure that people follow, right? First, I mean, we've gone over that in past conversations with Jeffrey Hinton and David Bow and so on, but if you can give people just a very short primer on what you mean by, AI systems are kind of like the human brain. And obviously, I assume you're referring to the fact that they're both forms of neural networks and that in key ways, the particular form of artificial intelligence that we've gotten that turned out to make much bigger advances than the alternative of symbolic AI that people had considered for a long time is in some ways sort of deliberately modeled on the human brain. And then the second point, just to draw out, is this remarkable thing that humans actually go by much less data and use much less energy. This is a point that a good friend of mine who's a neuroscientist made to me about his child, right? That his child has encountered vastly less language than ChatGPT has in its training data, and runs on cornflakes and the occasional hot dog, right? Whereas the amount of energy that is used to train the cutting edge AI models is just vastly more. So just explain those two facets.
Yeah. Well, first of all, we're large language models that we mostly talk about these days don't learn like babies do at all, right? They learn from text, and human babies learn a lot about language. They can speak by the age of 6 when they start reading. So reading is kind of secondary. Text is just a secondary representation of language, and so that's why they're slightly different. And I think we need to also build models that are more like humans. And so, but yeah, it's still true. So just to finish my thought, what LLMs tell us is the limits of what can be learned with an artificial intelligence, right? What are the limits? I don't think they tell us how they learn or how humans learn language. They just give us the limits, and that's impressive. But they're not really learning in the same way as humans do. So to go back to your question about the relationship between the brain and AI. So AI is in a sense a mathematical approximation, rough approximation of how neurons work. And the idea is that you can learn concepts and really complex things by just learning connections and their strengths between units that are called neurons. And it's a really exciting time now because AI is advancing and neuroscience is advancing, and we're starting to get understanding. So, you can use an AI model to simulate what's going on in our brain. You can use our brain to better understand what AI is doing. That's one of the big topics these days, is like how AI is learning and can we interpret it and look inside it. And that's something I'm really curious about as well. But the idea is that we now have an artificial approximation of the human brain, and there's a lot of interesting experiments we can do, and potentially also use those tools as also for all sorts of things, including scientific insight, including trying to understand what animals are saying.
Now help me clear up a confusion that I have here, which is that in my limited understanding of linguistics, I thought that the leading theory for how humans are able to acquire language so fast and are able to communicate is prepared by Noam Chomsky, and it's called universal grammar. And I'm going to butcher the details here, but the broad idea is that there's a set of grammatical possibilities that are sort of hard-coded into the brain, into the architecture of our mind, And then there's sort of a bunch of switches that flip one way or another, depending on the kind of language that you encounter as a baby and as an infant. But rather than having to learn grammar from scratch, there are those kind of pre-existing modalities, and that makes it much more efficient. That helps to explain why with cornflakes and hot dogs, dear Gabriel now can speak the English language, which is a remarkable feat. And you can see that by the fact that, there are these forms of these grammatical rules that we as humans follow without ever being aware of it, right? I don't think that more than 0.01% of the listeners to this podcast are going to be able to explain to me off the cuff the rule which governs which order adjectives go in the English language. And yet they will know that the little blue house is grammatical and the blue little house is not grammatical. And the explanation for that seems to be rooted in some ways in universal grammar. Now, presumably, we don't really understand the architecture of the brain enough to have replicated whatever structure that is supposed to be rooted in these AI models. It's not like people at Anthropic are studying Chomsky's models of universal grammar and say we have to arrange these layers of neurons in this very particular way to code for human language. All we did is to throw a bunch of data at these very sophisticated machines, and they picked up on that. And in fact, Claude today is 99.99% of the time going to say the little blue house and not the blue little house, because it too has somehow figured out the basic rules of language. But does that create a problem for Chomsky's theory of universal grammar? Does that indicate that perhaps linguists were wrong about that?
Yeah. You can think of that as historically, right? Linguistics of the 60s was influenced by the computer science of the 60s, right? And exactly what you said at the beginning. That's not how computers used to work, right? You had a pre-programmed program and it performed rules according to what you pre-programmed, right? So the worldview was there's a code, there's a background code, there's like probably genetic code, right? That has all those rules, all those switches, all those if-then statements. So language was considered an if-then statement, right? So now the paradigm is changing. So back in the day, so from logic if-then statements, we went into neural nets, and when you say 99% of the time, exactly, those are not rules anymore. Those are just tendencies based on trained neural networks. And so from rules to neural networks in computer science meant also, linguistics is now seeing things different. And people have been, arguing for this approach before. And so the idea is that you learn all the rules from just being exposed to data and making those connections inside your brain, those neural connections, so that at the end of the day, you're speaking as you've been taught by your parents. So I actually have a pet hypothesis for how we can conceptualize of language. We can just say it's informative imitation, and that's it. And then whatever comes after that is just a matter of complexity. But the idea is a child is born and it needs to imitate what it hears from the parents, right? It's making neural connections such that, gradually you're approximating what parents are saying, and your vocalizations crucially need to carry information that your caregivers are able to decode. So it's encoding information by imitation and decoding it. And so once you have that, then you loosen the limits, and then you can start admitting more things into the idea of language, and then it becomes a matter of complexity, right? So maybe humans have more complex language than whales, but the idea is that the basic principle is just imitation and informative transmission of information through your, say, vocalizations.
Good.
I just want to say one more thing. So back to LLMs and what they contribute to linguistics. So I think because they're able to do language now, this idea that you need the program, you need a pre-arranged, pre-innate, some genetic mutation that allowed you language is now gone because all you need is a general purpose, pattern discoverer or recognizer, and that is really important. That is really powerful, and it also another big question that is in that arena is the relationship between language and thought, right? So for the Chomsky's tradition, language and thought are basically one the same thing, intrinsically connected, and you cannot have complex thought without complex language. And what neuroscience is realizing these days that maybe language is just this like final stage, final externalization algorithm. So you have complex thought, you have, you can do complex processing, and language is just taking your complex thought and linearizing it into linear, sentences and words. And there's interesting work on aphasia patients showing that they can do all sorts of mathematical operation. They just cannot express them if you, for example, have a stroke in the area of the brain that damages your language. And so that is another paradigm shift, because if language is just externalization algorithm, then animals and other species might have pretty complex lives. It's just we haven't figured out their window to their lives yet. I mean, in some cases we have, right? For Alex the parrot, we use our own language. We learned Alex the parrot our language, and then we were able to see, oh wow, it can count, it can do all sorts of these complex operations. And maybe for other species, we just haven't found that window yet. And the hope is that we find that window.
So that last thought you had is fascinating to me, and that's the first time but I'm hearing this. So just to follow this carefully, the idea is that we might assume that what's going on when you're reflecting on something. Should I choose this restaurant or should I choose that restaurant? Should I take this job or should I take that job? Right? Should I become a monk or should I go and become an actor? Right? What's going on in my brain is a kind of linguistic process, right? It's nearly like I'm writing out the arguments for doing A or the arguments for doing B and raising objections to it. And even if that's not spoken aloud, unless I'm a little bit nuts, and perhaps even if I don't fully understand those words and I have internal monologue a lot of the time, but even if I don't, basically what's going on is in the form of language. And now you're saying, well, that is not how AI seem to reason. It's not how AI seem to produce language. We sort of force them to do that a little bit nowadays with reasoning models. You can kind of see a quasi chain of thought, but that's actually not what seems to be going on in the layers of neuron that are activating and all of that. And so perhaps that's actually not what's going on in the brain when I'm deliberating about something. What's going on is some very different process. And the last step of that is that either in my own brain, I'm translating that into language that I have internal voice, or certainly if I then want to explain to Gašper what it is that I'm saying, I say, okay, here are the conventions that I know I can fall back on in order to speak to you, and so I'm translating unconsciously this set of thoughts that I'm having into this language for the tool of communication. That's quite a striking thought. Is this sort of one hypothesis among others at the moment? Do you sort of how?
Well, yeah, it's pretty complex, but maybe all the concepts, so obviously you have words to denote things, right? But when you do processing, are you thinking in this higher level space that doesn't necessarily tie each concept to a word? And then you go back and then explain everything in words. That's probably one model that I would maybe subscribe to at this point. I mean, the jury is still out, but the idea is that the complex thinking does not evolve always just at discrete words, right? Some people have inner voice. Fedorenko says that other people don't. But the idea is that I think both AI and human brain actually operate in many ways quite similarly. And actually there are interesting experiments you can perform on that in that area. But the idea is that maybe language does not penetrate into all layers of complex thought, right? Probably it's easier to be intelligent if you have ways to call things, call objects, and represent them. But when you do complex math, you don't need the entirety of language. So when you calculate 8 times 7, well, maybe you remember that one from primary school, but like if I ask you like
17 times 9.
Exactly, you would do some sort of reasoning, but you would not be like, for example, one of the most difficult exercises on elementary school is explain your answer. Right? You have to externalize everything, explain it step by step. Also, one really interesting aspect about LLMs is the so-called chain of thought. Right? LLMs become really, really good when they got chain of thought, when they were not just answering immediately then a kind of knee-jerk reaction to your question, but when they were able to kind of internally subdivide complex questions into simpler questions and then give you the final answer, right? So when you ask me like, tell me what language is, I first started dissecting things. And when we allowed LLMs to do that, they become really good. And by the way, they started doing language really well. Not only that they were, that when you said our readers will not be able to explain why it's a blue car, a big blue car, and not blue big car. LLMs started explaining that. They were started to be so good once they got the chain of thought. So going back to chain of thought, it's really interesting to look inside those LLMs and see what they're doing with the chain of thought. And sometimes they do some complete gibberish, yet the answer is still perfectly correct. So it actually was... when you said sometimes they explain how they got to the answer, we needed to train them to explain how they got to the answer.
Right.
And so maybe that is indicative that what's going on in our thought is just some kind of high level combination of concepts that we are really effectively computing, and then we go down back to language and explain it, right? And so I think that would kind of be the relationship between the language and thought that I would currently subscribe to. But again, there's still a lot that needs to be done for that answer to be question to be answered fully.
How does that relate to this idea that I always hear bandied about in these discussions of artificial intelligence and LLMs, of these bots just being stochastic parrots? And I think that there's kind of two things going on here, right? I mean, one is that I actually think this is a bit of a deepity. So for those who don't know the term, a deepity is like the idea that love is but a word, and it's also sort of modern Bailey, right? So the idea that love is but a word relies on a straightforward interpretation of that sentence. That is obviously true. Love is a word in the English language, so obviously it's a word. And a much deeper sense that would be much more interesting, but actually turns out to be implausible, which is that there's no such thing as romantic love in the world. People don't really feel it. You can't really trust anybody, whatever else you might take to be the implication of that sentence. And that, I personally think, is untrue and unrealistic and shouldn't be taken very seriously as an idea. And sort of the plausibility, the seeming depth of this phrase trades on the kind of switching back and forth between the two different meanings. And I think when people talk about the stochastic parrot, there's a kind of sense in which that is obviously true, which is that the way in which these models are trained is that it's next token prediction. So, you give a bunch of text and you say, here's the first 47 words of this text. What do you think the 48 word, or more specifically token, is? And, for a set of processes, they get better over time at doing that. And so, they're trained to predict the next token, and in a way that's like a stochastic parrot. I think that's kind of like the other side of this is that, if they're stochastic parrots, then they're like this famous example of like the monkeys that are spending an infinite amount of time just typing random stuff on their keyboard until they come up with the works of Shakespeare, right? Where like there's just no actual goal-directed process going on here. And there it seems to me that in the first sense, yes, LLMs are stochastic parrots in a trivial sense, but it's not very interesting. In the latter sense, it's just not true, right? I mean, every now and again, LLMs mess up, but it's just not true that they just push out random gibberish and once in a blue moon it happens to be meaningful.
Right.
Like most of the time, they address my question in a clearly goal-directed way, which indicates some kind of understanding. So that's my general thought I just had listening to you. This is the first time I'm kind of formulating it in this particular way about the stochastic parrot thing. But the other thing is that the way you've actually been talking about how humans acquire language and perhaps how other animals acquire language sounds kind of similar to stochastic parrots too, right?
Yeah.
So once we sort of have a right understanding of a sense in which LLMs might be stochastic parrots, are we ourselves not also stochastic parrots?
Those are some really deep questions. I think we're, in a sense, we are stochastic parrot. That's a controversial opinion a little bit, but um, I think we need to understand that LLMs, again, do not learn language like humans. Okay, and that's good and bad. I mean, I think the people are conflating in some ways two things here. We have the engineering device, which are LLMs. And I think they can reason incredibly complex stuff. I mean, it's not just that they're providing answers. Now with chain of thought, for example, they can not only they do language and they'll be correct 99% of the time with all the rules, like literally all the rules, and they were never thought rules. They can also reason about language. So they can have meta-linguistic awareness, right? So they can do higher level reasoning. They can do higher level mathematics. I think that is it. Well, it's hard to know exactly what it means to be a stochastic parrot, but the performance they do is impressive enough that I don't think just simple next well, that you can simplify all they do into some very simple operation. I think what's happening is they learn concepts about the world in some ways similarly to how we learn concepts about the world. Like the mapping between concepts in our brain probably has some relationship to the mapping between the connections in their artificial neural networks. And so they're able to make those connections and process complex concepts among each other in a very efficient way and give a performance that is impressive. I mean, like 5 years ago, none of this conversation would be happening, and that's really impressive. But that's an engineering product, right? I think what is programmatic is then to say, well, are they doing things in the exact same way as we are? If we've built them to do something relatively different, right? Humans learn language by listening and speaking and imitating and getting messages across to people that surround us. So I've been really trying to make that distinction. I think we can use the same architectures, the same principles that we have in neural nets and build models that are more realistic, right? A model that needs to just speak and listen and interact with the environment. And I think we're going to see improvements in, they're exciting results there as well. And we're going to see even better improvements there. And then that will really help us understand, are we similar or different, and exactly what the mechanisms are. So I think we need to distinguish between scientific simulations and an engineering product.
That's very interesting. What do you think the implications of this are for how much further progress is going to go on LLMs? One very simple confusion I have is, whether there's something like an upper limit on intelligence in general, and then secondarily, whether there's something like an upper limit on the intelligence of a machine that is trained on the work product of a species that has an upper limit on its intelligence, even if that has biological
right.
right? So, if the best we can feed LLMs in the training is the best text we can come up with and, a bunch of, other things, is there some way that they can sort of bootstrap themselves off of that and go off into a completely different realm of thought? Or is there a reason to think that inherently they're kind of going to stall out at the top level of human intelligence because that's all of the training that went into it? I don't know if this question even
Yeah.
makes sense,
No, no,
but
no.
help me puzzle through this.
It makes perfect sense. It's $1 million question, and I think it's one that we need to look to other species to answer, right? So we talked about exclusivity of language, right? So before, in the prior worldviews, you need a language specific center, organ, instinct, whatever. Um, the other worldview is no, basically you just increase the capacity, and all these things that we cherish about our intelligence and language just emerge, right? So, humans are just very, very smart primates. Um, and as you increase the complexity of the brain, things emerge on their own. And I'm much more in the second camp. And actually, the modeling work I do, a lot of the things, so we build models of AI models like LLMs, but more realistic ones, the ones that learn from speech only and are more brain inspired. A lot of things that we linguists cherish as symbolic computation emerged, right? I can show that like something like a phoneme or a morpheme, something that was in Chomsky's world considered to be a rule or a symbol, emerges in this neural computation, right? So these neural networks are incredibly efficient, and this kind of symbolic like computation emerges. And so does in our brain, right? And if you increase capacity, the capacity for symbolic like processing increases, and all of a sudden you have language, right? So and maybe language, I mean, in my opinion, language is a continuum, and consciousness is a continuum, right? As you increase that, um, a lot of things that we cherish about our intelligence emerge. Now, I think in that in under that worldview, if you increase the capacity of LLMs or other models, the intelligence will just increase or emerge.
Hmm.
And as for the upper limit, some people think that LLMs are a completely um, wrong way of thinking about intelligence. But I think what we're seeing is, from GPT-2, 3, 3.5, 4, and so on, or other models, as you increase their parameters, the performance just continues to increase. So if you subscribe to the second worldview, I think there is no, I mean, I'm lacking a complex, a valid or a convincing argument that would tell me as I'm increasing their capacity, at some point they'll just level off and not perform anymore well. One
Hmm.
thing that I'm observing with a lot of work with AI models is that they're not necessarily as original. Like they're very creative, but I define originality as a thing where you're proposing something that nobody has proposed before. Like Modigliani is an amazing painter, but not only that, he has a completely distinct style. It's not like taking two styles together, but like proposed a completely new style. And that's something I'm not seeing, but like maybe that's because the companies don't want to release a very a very original models, because probably that could go bad as in some bad directions as well.
Well, it may
So
also
I
take.
think
Good.
no, I think if I think in general, all else being equal, as you increase the brain connections, intelligence increases.